year did not clear its throat or ask for attention. It arrived quietly, stayed busy, and unknowingly became memorable while most people were occupied with supper, weather, and tomorrow. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. The year did not introduce itself. It did not announce a theme, distribute programs, or suggest that anyone take notes. It simply continued one morning, following another, confident that repetition was enough to justify existence. If years could shrug, this one would have done so early and often. Across the western lands, mornings began the same way they always had. Roads were patched, not because they were symbolic, but because wheels complained. Grain was counted not to prepare for destiny, but to survive winter without drama. Horses were tied, untied, and tied again. Hands hovered over hearth fires, with the practiced patience of people who trusted heat more than headlines. Distant rumors, battles elsewhere, borders shifting beyond familiar hills, were acknowledged politely and then placed aside, the way one sets down a tool that is interesting but not immediately useful. Dinner still needed salt. Roofs still needed fixing. History, if it wanted attention, would have to wait its turn. In the east, the rhythm was no louder. Couriers moved with documents that smelled faintly of ink and routine. Court officials adjusted seals, reviewed lists, and argued about precedents with the calm intensity reserved for things that happen every day. Borders breathed in wind and dust, indifferent to the paperwork meant to define them. Caravans measured water by days rather than by ambition, calculating survival with a precision that left little room for legend. Nothing here felt like a turning point. Everything felt like maintenance. This is the uncomfortable truth about most years. They are not designed to be remembered. They exist to be inhabited. The people living inside them are rarely aware that someone, centuries later, might lean forward and whisper, "This was important." Importance is a retrospective hobby. In the moment, it mostly feels like chores. The year moved forward, carried by people who had no interest in carrying it. Bakers woke before dawn because bread requires that sort of loyalty. Farmers read the sky with the quiet expertise of those who know clouds are more reliable than proclamations. Merchants haggled with a seriousness that suggested the price of rope mattered more than the fate of empires, which, to be fair, it often did. Children learned rules, forgot them, and learned them again. Elders repeated stories that had already survived longer than anyone expected. Nothing about these actions suggested they were participating in something called history. They were participating in Tuesday. If there was irony in the air, it went mostly unnoticed. Years that later acquire reputations tend to do so while no one is looking directly at them. They become famous not because they tried, but because they failed to stop being ordinary, while extraordinary things brushed past their edges. The year did not seek drama. Drama found it anyway, tapping politely at the door, then waiting because the household was busy. From a distance, it might seem strange that so much routine could coexist with so much potential change. From inside the year, it felt completely normal. Systems worked because they had worked yesterday. Authority functioned because it had learned how to sound calm. Faith in tomorrow was not philosophical, it was practical. People slept because sleep was necessary, not because they trusted the future. Waking up was an agreement made with the body, not with history. The quiet competence of the year was its most misleading feature. Calm did not mean safety, it meant familiarity. Streets were safe enough to cross because they were crossed daily. Markets functioned because everyone knew where to stand. Even anxiety had a schedule. Worry arrived at expected hours and left, when addressed with enough routine to satisfy it. This was not ignorance, it was efficiency. If the year had a personality, it would be the kind that avoids mirrors, not out of insecurity, but out of disinterest. Reflection slows things down, and the year preferred motion, slow, continuous, unremarkable motion. Time passed the way water passes stones, not to shape them intentionally, but because movement is unavoidable. Somewhere between one sunrise and the next, messages traveled farther than their senders imagined. Decisions were made that felt temporary, but would age badly, the way all confident assumptions do. None of this felt urgent at the time. Urgency is a tone applied later, once consequences become visible. In the moment, everything still fit into existing schedules. It is tempting to imagine that people sensed something approaching, that there was a collective pause, a shared intuition that this year matters. There was not. What there was instead was trust in continuity, a belief gentle, practical, and faintly ironic that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to require no revision of habits. This belief allowed the year to proceed without resistance. It allowed history to move quietly without needing permission. And history prefers it that way. Loud years attract scrutiny. Quiet ones slip through carrying more than anyone realizes. When attention is low, changes travel faster. When no one is watching, structures adjust themselves. With minimal explanation. The year did not know it was being observed because observation had not yet been invented for it. So it continued. Fires burned down to coals and were rekindled without ceremony. Letters were written, delivered, and forgotten. Paths were walked into grooves, deep enough to guide the next generation without instruction. Life did what life always does. It insisted on being lived at human scale, regardless of how much larger narratives hovered nearby. This is where our listening begins, not at a climax, not at a declaration, but inside the steady hum of a year that believed it was just another year. A year that mistook anonymity for insignificance. A year that never paused to ask what it would become once memory caught up with it. Tonight we do not rush it. We follow it slowly, step by step, through kitchens and roads, offices and camps, through gestures so small they seem beneath notice, because this is where history hides best inside days that think they are invisible. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson already forming, though no one in the year would have phrased it this way. History does not announce itself when it arrives. It waits, it blends in, it lets people finish dinner. Frankish mornings, bread, tools, and no big announcements. Morning in the Frankish lands did not begin with speeches. It began with sound, the dull scrape of a wooden door, the cough of a hearth reawakening, the unmistakable grind of grain meeting stone. If the year had a voice here, it was low and repetitive, saying the same thing every morning. There is work to do, and it will not do itself. Villages across Western Europe woke in fragments rather than unison. Someone was always already awake. Someone else always pretended not to be. Fields did not wait for consensus, they waited for weather. The rhythm of life here was not ideological, it was seasonal. Soil dictated schedules more convincingly than any ruler ever could. Spring asked for seed. Summer asked for endurance. Autumn demanded accounting. Winter accepted only those who had prepared. The village was not small because people lacked ambition. It was small because smallness functioned. Everyone knew where things were kept. Everyone knew who owed whom and what that debt looked like, not in abstract coin, but in sacks of grain, in days of labor, in a future promise measured against harvest yields. Trust here was practical. It did not require affection, only memory. Bread sat at the center of this system, not because it was symbolic, but because it was unavoidable. Grain moved through hands like a shared language. It was grown, stored, taxed, borrowed, repaid, sometimes argued over, rarely romanticized. Mills mattered more than monuments. A functioning mill could stabilize a community more effectively than any proclamation. When the mill worked, people ate. When it failed, explanations followed, but always too late to be useful. Tools were repaired rather than replaced. Wood was shaped, reshaped, and shaped again. Iron was scarce enough to be respected, but common enough to be depended on. Nothing here suggested a world on the brink of transformation. Everything suggested continuity held together by maintenance. If progress existed, it arrived quietly, disguised as a slightly better plow or a roof that leaked less than it had last year. Markets appeared and disappeared on predictable days, like a shared illusion everyone agreed to participate in. Stalls were temporary, but relationships were not. Prices fluctuated within limits set by familiarity. No one expected fairness in the modern sense. What they expected was consistency. A dishonest merchant would not be corrected by law first, but by reputation. Justice moved at walking speed. Power, as experienced by ordinary people, rarely wore impressive clothing. It arrived instead as obligation, a request that could not easily be refused, a portion of grain measured out carefully, knowing that every handful removed today would be missed in February. Authority introduced itself not with banners but with schedules. Someone knocked, someone counted, someone remembered. The chronicles would later write of Charles Martel, of battles and strategies, of names worth preserving. But for most people alive in these mornings, power was not a man. It was a system that asked for its due regardless of weather or fatigue. It was the expectation that you would show up when required, lend when called upon, and accept that refusal had consequences that were rarely immediate, but always cumulative. There is a temptation to imagine fear shaping these lives, but fear is inefficient as a daily motivator. What kept society running was predictability. People knew what was expected of them because it had been expected of their parents. This knowledge produced compliance without spectacle. No announcements were necessary. The system did not need to shout. It had already been heard. Houses were built close enough for convenience, far enough for privacy. Storage mattered more than decoration. Barns were quiet archives of survival. Inside them rested not just grain, but assumptions about the future, that winter would come, that people would endure it, that spring would return on time. Optimism here was not emotional, it was logistical. Children learned quickly what mattered, not through instruction but through observation. They learned which tools were touched with care, which spaces were respected, which adults spoke when decisions were being made. Education was informal, but relentless. By the time someone was old enough to work, they already knew how things functioned because they had watched them function for years. Time moved differently here. Days were long, but years blurred. The calendar was less important than the field. Saints' days existed, but harvest days mattered more. Memory was organized around seasons, not dates. People remembered the wet summer or the winter the roof collapsed, not numerical markers. History, in this environment, struggled to find purchase. The humor of it all, if one allows a gentle smile, lies in how little this world cared about its eventual significance. The systems that held Frankish society together were never designed to impress future historians. They were designed to work, and they did, quietly, stubbornly, without requesting applause. History, which prefers hammers and headlines, would later try to force meaning into these mornings. The people living them preferred grain. Even conflict, when it appeared, rarely disrupted routine for long. Armies passed through, fields were trampled, losses were absorbed with a grim efficiency born of experience. Reconstruction began not because of hope, but because there was no alternative. To stop was to starve. Resilience was not a virtue here. It was a necessity so common, it went unnamed. Religion existed certainly, but as part of the schedule rather than an escape from it. Prayers fit between tasks, rituals marked time without suspending it. Faith was woven into life the way smoke clung to clothing present, persistent, but rarely discussed unless something went wrong. What mattered most was not belief, but endurance. And so the mornings continued. Bread baked, tools wore down. Debts were noted mentally, then physically, then forgiven or enforced, depending on circumstance. No one stood up to declare that the Frankish world was stable or that it was changing. Stability and change arrived together, mixed so thoroughly they were indistinguishable from normality. This is the paradox that quiet years depend on. While attention drifts elsewhere, systems do their most important work. They normalize authority. They teach compliance without coercion. They make extraction feel ordinary. By the time anyone thinks to question them, they are already assumed. The year did not need to announce itself here because it was carried forward on the backs of habits older than memory. These mornings were not dramatic. They were effective. And effectiveness, in history, is often mistaken for inevitability. But nothing here felt inevitable to the people living it. It felt earned, day by day, loaf by loaf. The future was not a concept. It was a calculation. And as long as the mill turned, the oven stayed warm, and the knock came at a predictable hour, life continued without commentary. History would later arrive, armed with interpretation. For now, the Frankish morning remained what it had always been, a place where power hid in plain sight, disguised as routine, and where the most important work was done quietly before anyone thought to write it down. Al-Andalus at the edge, quiet cities, loud borders. Al-Andalus did not feel like a frontier when you stood inside its cities. Frontiers are supposed to feel thin, nervous, unfinished. This place felt measured, calm, intentionally arranged. If there was an edge here, it was not obvious from the inside. It hid behind paperwork, behind irrigation schedules, behind the steady confidence of people who believed tomorrow would arrive on time because someone had already planned for it. Cities woke without urgency, not because nothing mattered, but because everything already had a place. Streets were swept early, not ceremonially, but to keep dust from returning too quickly. Shops opened in sequences learned through habit rather than law. Artisans worked with the patience of people who understood that precision, not speed, preserved reputations. The day unfolded like a document written long ago and recopied faithfully. Land here was not simply owned. It was measured, surveyed, marked, remembered. Boundaries existed not to provoke argument but to prevent it. Water, especially, demanded attention. Channels were cleaned, redirected, repaired. Irrigation did not perform heroics. It performed reliability. Fields stayed green not because of miracle, but because someone upstream respected a timetable. This was power at its most persuasive. Invisible, technical, and largely uncelebrated. Paper mattered. Not the dramatic kind, not declarations or manifestos, but lists, records, receipts, permissions written in careful hands. Literacy here was not rare enough to be magical, nor common enough to be ignored. People learned letters not to become famous, but to function, to read a notice, to copy an order, to ensure that a transaction today would still make sense tomorrow. Writing was not a spectacle. It was infrastructure. Crafts flourished quietly. Leatherworkers knew how long hides needed to rest. Potters understood clay the way farmers understood soil, by touch, by resistance, by memory. Workshops did not announce themselves. They simply existed, producing objects that would outlast conversations about them. These were not the kinds of activities that inspire legends. They were the kinds that make legends possible by keeping people clothed, fed, and supplied with containers that did not leak. Markets moved with calm confidence. Goods arrived, prices adjusted, disputes were settled without requiring anyone to raise their voice. Regulation existed, but it felt procedural rather than oppressive. Authority, when present, wore the neutral expression of administration. The system preferred compliance through clarity. Confusion was inefficient, and inefficiency was the closest thing this society had to a sin. Time here was anchored during the reign of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, though few people living these days would have framed it that way. Rulers changed names, routines changed slowly. For most residents, governance was experienced not as ideology, but as continuity, the same forms, the same expectations, the same quiet insistence that order was not optional. Education occurred in modest spaces, not grand halls, but rooms where ink was precious, and mistakes were corrected gently but firmly. Learning was practical. Reading was taught because it solved problems. Writing was practiced because it preserved agreements. Knowledge here did not rush toward abstraction. It stayed close to application. The goal was not enlightenment, but competence. There is something faintly ironic about how advanced systems often feel least dramatic while operating. Al-Andalus functioned well enough that it did not need to announce itself as exceptional. Its success was embedded in daily life, not displayed on banners. Visitors noticed the cleanliness, the organization, the confidence, but residents simply called it normal. Borders, however, told a different story. At the edges, noise returned. Movement accelerated. Messages arrived with more urgency. The calm of the cities contrasted sharply with the tension beyond them. But even here, drama was managed. Garrison towns followed schedules. Supplies were counted. Logistics mattered more than speeches. Conflict was prepared for with lists rather than slogans. The people inside the cities were aware, vaguely, that they lived near a boundary. Awareness did not translate into obsession. Life continued because life always does. Borders are loud only when you listen to them directly. Most people did not. They listened to water in channels, to tools on stone, to the scratch of reed pens against paper. Authority in Al-Andalus presented itself through process. Taxes were assessed, collected, recorded, not with theatrical force, but with administrative certainty. Resistance existed, of course, but it was softened by predictability. When people know what will be asked of them, compliance becomes a calculation rather than a confrontation. The system did not need fear. It had forms. Even belief systems, deeply held though they were, did not interrupt routine. Practices fit around work rather than replacing it. Time was segmented carefully so that devotion did not dismantle productivity. This balance was not accidental. It was learned. Over generations, societies discover which intensities are sustainable. Excess of any kind exhausts. Humor emerges quietly in such environments. Not jokes exactly, but a shared understanding that the most important things are rarely the loudest. Borders may make noise, historians may argue, but cities endure through quieter virtues, patience, measurement, repetition, the kind of qualities that do not travel well in stories, but travel very well across decades. It is tempting, looking backward, to frame this moment as precarious, to imagine everything balanced on a knife's edge, but that is hindsight speaking too loudly. From within the year, the balance felt stable enough to lean on. Not perfect, not eternal, just workable. And workable systems inspire loyalty, not because they are loved, but because they are relied upon. Al-Andalus did not define itself by opposition, it defined itself by operation, by the steady translation of authority into procedure, by the belief that cities should function even when borders tremble. This was not naivety, it was strategy. Stability at the center allowed noise at the edges to be managed rather than mirrored. And so the days passed. Ink dried. Clay hardened. Water flowed where it was told to flow. People learned letters, then taught them to others. Nothing about this demanded attention from history, which is precisely why history later became so interested. For now, the cities remained quiet, the borders remained loud, and between them stretched a society held together not by spectacle, but by the patient confidence of systems that did not need to explain themselves. Between Tours and Poitiers, the week before, the world gets a headline. The week did not know it was standing between two names. It did not pause to check maps or consult future textbooks. It moved forward the way weeks usually do, unevenly, distracted, mildly inconvenient. If there was tension in the air, it was subtle enough to be mistaken for weather. Between Tours and Poitiers, life continued at ground level, carts still rolled, hooves still needed trimming. Paths were measured not by strategy but by habit. People who transported goods adjusted their loads based on road conditions, not rumors. A wheel cracked. Someone fixed it. Urgency, when it appeared, had more to do with rain clouds than with armies. This is the part history struggles to describe, the days when nothing obvious changes, yet everything is technically about to. The future leans closer, but does not tap anyone on the shoulder. Instead, it waits, politely, while people attend to tasks that cannot be postponed, simply because something important may be happening somewhere else. Shepherds still counted animals with the same mild anxiety they always carried. Grazing land was discussed with seriousness bordering on tenderness. Grass does not grow faster because men are marching nearby. Fences still needed mending. Livestock still needed water. Animals famously do not care about geopolitics. They care about grass. Wine cellars worried about barrels, not about symbols or supply lines, but about wood swelling in damp air. A bad barrel could ruin a season. A bad season could undo years of careful reputation building. The week's great fear for many was not defeat or victory, but leakage. The quiet terror of discovering that something you trusted to hold had failed overnight. News arrived inconsistently. Someone had heard something, someone else had heard a different version. Distances distorted everything. What sounded like certainty in one village arrived as speculation in the next. Messages lost confidence as they traveled. By the time they reached people who might have cared, they had softened into background noise. Interesting perhaps, but not actionable. This is how most people experience approaching conflict, as a vague hum rather than a clear signal. There is no cinematic buildup, no synchronized awareness, just fragments. A sense that more people are moving than usual, that horses are being fed differently, that some roads feel less friendly after dark. None of this is decisive enough to interrupt routine. In the fields, autumn did what autumn always does. Crops reached the point where delay became dangerous. Harvest waited for no confrontation. Grain had to be brought in while it could still be dried properly. The land insisted on priority. History would have to cue. At night, fires burned low. Conversations drifted, rarely settling on anything dramatic. People talked about weather, about aches, about whether a roof would survive another winter. Someone mentioned that soldiers had passed nearby. Someone else shrugged. Soldiers passed often enough to lose novelty. What mattered was whether they paid for what they took and whether they moved on quickly. October approached with the usual indifference. If there was an encounter coming, it announced itself only as increased movement. More men, more animals, more equipment. The land absorbed this traffic without comment. Paths widened slightly, grass flattened, ruts deepened. The earth recorded everything, but did not interpret it. The moment that would later be labeled compressed into a phrase, argued over, revisited, endlessly arrived as a distant sound, not a roar. More like a low disruption carried on wind that did not bother to explain itself. For many it was heard only indirectly, for others not at all. Distance diluted significance. What matters for our purposes is not the clash itself. History will take care of that loudly and repeatedly. What matters is how little it altered the immediate rhythm of life for most people nearby. There was no universal pause, no shared intake of breath, just a continuation of tasks interrupted briefly by curiosity, then resumed out of necessity. The night passed, it always does. Morning arrived without commentary. Rain followed its own schedule. Roofs leaked where they had been threatening to leak for months. Someone climbed up with tools, uninterested in outcomes that did not keep water out of the house. The rain, famously impartial, showed no preference for victors. This is where irony settles in, gently. The event that would become a headline, simplified, dramatized, sharpened into meaning, was experienced by most people as an inconvenience at the edge of awareness. The day after, people were tired for reasons unrelated to destiny. Muscles ached. Sleep had been poor. Work resumed because it had to. Transport resumed almost immediately. Goods still needed to move. Routes adjusted slightly, then normalized. Commerce is remarkably resilient to narrative. It bends, detours, and continues. A blocked road becomes an alternative path. A missing customer becomes a different one. The system absorbs shock quietly. Animals were fed, tools were cleaned, wood was stacked where it would dry properly. None of this suggested that a turning point had occurred. Turning points are a luxury of hindsight. In the present, they feel like messes to be cleaned up. There is a strange calm that settles after distant disruption. Not relief exactly, more like resignation. People accept that something happened elsewhere and that their responsibilities remain unchanged. This acceptance is not indifference, it is survival. The world does not stop offering problems just because it has added a new one. History prefers to imagine these days as charged with significance, as if everyone sensed the weight of the moment. But weight is easier to carry when it is distributed across generations. For those living inside the week, the load was lighter because it was not labeled. Even authority, in the aftermath, appeared cautiously. Adjustments were made, expectations clarified, but there was no dramatic reordering of daily life overnight. Systems do not reinvent themselves quickly. They adapt incrementally, pretending continuity even when change has already begun. The most honest description of this week is not suspenseful. It is ordinary under pressure, a stretch of days when the world edged toward a story while most people kept their eyes on immediate needs, when the future brushed past quietly, careful not to interrupt. Later, the names of places would be paired together, fused into a single phrase. Arguments would gather around it. Meaning would be poured generously over something that, at the time, barely registered beyond a radius of concern. This is not deception. It is how memory works. It sharpens what was once dull. For now, though, we stay with the week itself, with carts rolling, with barrels swelling, with roofs leaking and being repaired, with rain falling on everyone equally. The world did not know it was about to get a headline, and the people living in it wisely did not wait for one before continuing their day. The Mediterranean doesn't pause. Ports, rope, salt, and routine. The Mediterranean Sea does not pause for significance. It has never learned the habit. Tides arrive without consulting calendars. Winds keep appointments they made long before anyone thought to record them. If the year felt quiet, it was because the sea was doing what it always does, moving goods, people, and expectations with a patience that makes drama look inefficient. Ports woke before cities fully remembered themselves. Rope creaked first, then wood, then voices that knew exactly how loud they needed to be and no louder. Dock workers moved with the confidence of people who had learned the weight of things through repetition rather than instruction. Nothing here was symbolic. Everything was measurable. You could feel it in your hands and argue about it honestly. Salt mattered, not as an idea, but as a preservative that bought time. Fish were dried, stacked, counted, and trusted to last because they had lasted before. Olive oil traveled in containers designed by experience, not theory. Cloth arrived rough, left softer, and carried the quiet fingerprints of everyone who had touched it along the way. This was not luxury. This was continuity. Ships came in because ships come in. A year that deserves to be called calm is one where arrivals do not require explanation. Sails lowered, cargo shifted, payments noted. The sea did not ask whether news from inland mattered today. It delivered what it had been carrying and waited for instructions that were mostly about balance and timing. Merchants lived inside margins. They understood that profit was not found in boldness but in reliability. A late shipment could undo trust built carefully over years. A dishonest measure would be remembered longer than a generous one. Contracts were spoken, written, implied, and enforced by memory more than force. Accounting books whispered more authority than speeches ever could. There is a gentle irony to maritime power. It depends on things that look fragile: rope frays, wood swells, sails tear, and yet systems built on these materials moved empires quietly. The port was proof that durability is not about strength alone. It is about repair, about knowing exactly how much strain something can take before it needs attention. Sailors carried habits from coast to coast. They learned which ports respected weights and which preferred arguments. They knew where water tasted better, where inns asked fewer questions, where work appeared consistently enough to justify return. Their world was mapped not by borders but by reliability. A good harbor was remembered. A bad one was avoided. Memory again did the work of law. Stevedores counted without ceremony. Loads were shifted with practiced indifference to their contents. Oil was oil, salt was salt, fish was fish. Importance did not vary by narrative, only by spoilage. If something could rot, it moved faster. If it could wait, it did. The port understood time differently than the battlefield. Urgency here was chemical. Paper rustled quietly, scales tipped and corrected themselves. Measures were checked, then checked again, not because anyone was suspicious, but because error accumulates invisibly. The most powerful sound in the port was not shouting. It was agreement. A nod. A mark made beside a number. Confirmation that what was expected had arrived as expected. In taverns near the water, conversation drifted. Sailors spoke of winds, not outcomes. Merchants spoke of rates, not rumors. News from inland arrived eventually, softened by distance and retold without urgency. The port had learned something important. Information that does not affect cargo can wait. The sea had no interest in debates that did not change tides. A year like this felt trustworthy to the Mediterranean. Trust here did not mean peace. It meant predictability. Storms came and went. Losses were absorbed, routes adjusted. But the underlying rhythm remained intact. When the sea is allowed to do its work uninterrupted, it teaches patience to everyone who depends on it. Fishmongers rose early. Their success depended on hours, not hope. Drying racks were checked. Salt was applied with care that bordered on affection. Preservation was an act of faith grounded in chemistry. If done properly, it extended usefulness. If done poorly, it punished optimism harshly. There was no romance in failure. Olive oil traveled quietly. It did not announce quality. It proved it slowly, over meals, across months. Cloth did the same. Worn daily, washed repeatedly, it became part of bodies rather than wardrobes. These goods mattered because they disappeared into routine. They supported lives without asking for recognition. The Mediterranean specialized in making movement feel normal. When movement becomes normal, anxiety recedes. People plan, they borrow, they promise delivery weeks in advance because experience suggests those promises will be kept often enough to justify risk. This is how systems grow large without feeling heavy. Occasionally, ships did not arrive. Everyone noticed. Adjustments were made, prices shifted slightly, alternatives were considered. But absence did not collapse the system. It stressed it gently, reminding everyone that redundancy mattered. The sea tolerated interruption as long as it was not constant. Humor surfaced in small ways. Dock workers joked about waits that were honest today. Sailors blamed winds for choices they would have made anyway. Merchants complained loudly about taxes they quietly calculated into prices. This was not cynicism, it was fluency. People who understand systems well enough to joke about them are rarely surprised by them. The Mediterranean, in this year, carried on without commentary. It did not acknowledge distant tensions. It did not slow to reflect. It moved because movement was its nature. The ports responded in kind, maintaining a choreography refined through repetition. Every gesture assumed that tomorrow would require the same competence. At night, lanterns reflected on water that refused to hold images for long. Crews slept in shifts. Guards watched out of habit rather than fear. The sea listened without responding. Somewhere inland, events accumulated meaning. Here, meaning dissolved into salt air and routine. If history wanted the Mediterranean to pause, it chose the wrong character. The sea does not stop to mark occasions. It marks time by erosion, by accumulation, by the quiet replacement of one plank at a time. In that sense, it is the most honest witness, present, indifferent, indispensable. And so the year remained calm here, not because nothing happened, but because everything necessary continued. Ships arrived, goods moved, accounts balanced closely enough. The Mediterranean did not pause. It never does. Byzantium's paper empire, ink that holds the night together. In the eastern half of Europe, power learned how to whisper. It did not rely on the echo of speeches or the glare of ceremony. It relied on paper, quiet, thin, patient paper, and on ink that dried slowly enough to be corrected, but firmly enough to be trusted. In Constantinople, the night held together not by walls alone, but by documents stacked neatly while lamps burned low. This was an empire that understood fatigue. It understood that shouting exhausts a system, while procedure lets it rest. Offices closed at predictable hours. Locks were checked. Seals cooled. Clerks' stretched fingers cramped from copying, not because the work was dramatic, but because it was constant. If the empire felt heavy, it was because it was carefully distributed across desks, rather than concentrated in fists. Officials moved through corridors carrying bundles that weighed less than armor and accomplished more than swords. Tax registers mattered, storage inventories mattered, legal codes mattered, not as abstractions, but as tools that turned chaos into something that could be postponed until morning. People imagine empires surviving on glory. This one survived on filing. Ink traveled farther than most soldiers. A single directive, copied correctly, could adjust behavior across regions without anyone needing to raise their voice. Orders did not hurry. They arrived. Arrival was enough. The act of being written implied legitimacy. The act of being archived implied permanence. Warehouses slept full. Grain lay measured, counted, guarded not by fear but by routine. Someone knew how much was there. Someone else knew when it would be needed. This knowledge produced calm. Hunger is frightening. Accounting is soothing. The empire chose the second as often as possible. Law functioned similarly. Codes were not read daily, but they were present. Like a wall you do not think about until you lean on it. Disputes were absorbed into process. Complaints entered queues. Resolutions emerged with a delay that felt deliberate rather than negligent. Justice here was not fast. It was consistent. Consistency over time becomes a form of mercy. Under the reign of Leo III, the machinery did not reinvent itself. It refined. Adjustments were made not to impress, but to keep friction low. Systems that work do not crave applause, they crave maintenance, and maintenance is most effective when boring. The mimesis of order forms that looked similar, language that repeated itself, was intentional. Familiarity reduces error. When every document feels slightly repetitive, mistakes become easier to spot. The empire leaned into sameness. It trusted monotony as a defense against collapse. Clerks learned handwriting as a discipline of restraint. Letters were shaped carefully, not artistically. Flourish was discouraged. Clarity was rewarded. Ink stains were corrected patiently. Paper did not forgive sloppiness easily, and neither did the supervisors who checked it. This was a world where neatness carried moral weight, not because it was beautiful, but because it was reliable. Taxes arrived without spectacle. They were expected, anticipated, budgeted emotionally long before they were collected physically. Payment was not framed as punishment. It was framed as participation. The state did not need to convince people of its necessity every year. It demonstrated necessity through continuity. Roads stayed passable, granaries stayed stocked, courts remained open. The argument made itself. Seals mattered. Wax cooled into authority. A document without a seal felt unfinished, vulnerable, slightly unreal. With a seal, it became part of a chain longer than any individual. Breaking a seal was an act taken seriously because it implied interruption. The empire disliked interruption. It preferred flow. At night, lamps burned where numbers were reconciled. Totals were checked against totals. Margins were examined. Discrepancies were noted without panic. Panic disrupts handwriting. Calm preserves legibility. The empire's greatest talent was not control, but patience. There is gentle humor in imagining sleepless nights sustained by spreadsheets. People expect empires to glow. Byzantium preferred to glow dimly through oil lamps illuminating columns of figures. If magnificence existed, it lived elsewhere. Here, stability was the aesthetic. The paper empire extended beyond the capital. Copies traveled outward, multiplying like controlled echoes. Each copy carried the same authority as the original, not because it was original, but because it was accurate. Accuracy became a virtue that outlived personalities. Names changed. Titles shifted. Procedures endured. Education in this environment favored precision over inspiration. Students learned to read carefully, to copy faithfully, to understand that deviation carried risk. Creativity had its place, but not here. Here, the goal was continuity. To become invisible within the system was considered a success. Critics existed, of course. They complained of complexity, of slowness, of paper strangling initiative. And sometimes they were right. But complexity also absorbed shock. When something failed, it failed locally, contained by layers of procedure. The empire did not collapse easily because it had learned how to compartmentalize disappointment. Night fell and the city quieted. But the empire did not sleep completely. Watchmen changed shifts, account books rested, waiting for morning. Ink dried. The silence was not emptiness, it was readiness. Everything had been placed where it would be found again. From the outside, this might look tedious. From within, it felt reassuring. The presence of rules meant the absence of improvisation. Improvisation is expensive. Predictability is economical. The empire understood budgets in every sense. And so the night held. Not because of prayers shouted or banners waved, but because enough people had done their work carefully during the day. Because documents existed to be consulted. Because storage was accounted for. Because someone knew which shelf to check. If there is irony here, it is kind rather than sharp. People remember Byzantium for its splendor, its ceremonies, its shining mosaics. But much of its survival depended on quieter arts. Ink that did not smudge, seals that did not crack, clerks who did not rush. This is how empires outlast excitement. They make themselves boring enough to function. They replace spectacle with schedules. They let paper carry weight so people do not have to. As lamps dimmed and doors closed, the empire trusted that morning would arrive with the same needs it had prepared for last night. And in that trust, in that stack of documents, resting quietly, Byzantium slept, held together by ink. Steppe wind. Messages that travel faster than feelings. On the steppe, distance learned how to behave differently. It stretched, certainly, but it did not slow communication in the way settled societies expected. Here messages traveled faster than feelings. News moved before emotion had time to form an opinion about it. By the time people felt something, the information had already passed through their hands and continued onward, carried by wind, hooves, and habit. The steppe did not present itself as empty to those who knew how to read it. It was a corridor, a surface designed for motion. Paths appeared not because they were built, but because they were used often enough to become obvious. Messengers changed horses without ceremony. Alliances shifted without speeches. Gifts moved quietly between camps, heavy with implication, but light enough to be carried without strain. Nothing here lingered unnecessarily. Staying too long was inefficient. Even memory behaved differently. Stories were kept brief, sharpened by repetition. Excess detail was trimmed away by travel. What remained was what could survive motion. Messengers were practical people. They did not decorate information. They delivered it. Their loyalty was to accuracy and speed, not interpretation. A message arrived intact or it failed. Feelings were considered a local matter, something for the recipient to deal with after the facts had already moved on. Horses were exchanged with an efficiency that bordered on intimacy. Riders knew when an animal had given enough. There was no sentimentality in the handover. Gratitude was shown through care, not delay. The system depended on this discipline. Emotion slowed things down. The steppe preferred momentum. Alliances here were not abstract ideas. They were agreements, reinforced by movement, by visits, by shared routes, by the physical proof of continued contact. To stop traveling was to weaken a bond. Presence mattered more than declarations. A messenger arriving on time did more for stability than 100 promises delivered late. Gifts followed similar rules. They were not meant to impress crowds. They were meant to confirm relationships. Textiles, metalwork, animals, each item chosen not for spectacle, but for durability and recognition. A gift that traveled well-earned respect. One that broke en route was remembered unkindly. The steppe understood something settled worlds often forgot. Speed changes the shape of power. When information moves quickly, authority cannot rely on surprise for long. It must rely on response. Systems here adapted by staying light. Decisions were made with the assumption that news would outrun explanation. And yet, for all this motion, the steppe also knew how to stop. In 732, stone was raised into wind. The memorial of Tegan stood upright not to interrupt travel, but to endure it. The inscriptions did not demand immediate attention. They did not assume an audience gathered politely in front of them. They assumed time, wind, passing riders, occasional readers who might stop, briefly, then continue on. This was communication in a different register, not fast, but patient, not mobile, but immovable. The contrast was intentional. In a world where messages flew past before emotion could catch up, stone offered delay. Reflection, if anyone chose to engage in it. The writing did not hurry. It did not compete with the messengers. It complemented them. The stone understood that some messages are not meant to arrive quickly. They are meant to wait. Standing there between sky and grass, the monument did not explain itself loudly. It did not insist on relevance. It trusted that relevance would eventually arrive, carried by someone who had already heard enough and was ready to stop for a moment. There is a quiet irony here. Societies defined by motion chose stillness to remember. Worlds fluent in speed chose stone to speak slowly. The steppe, which rarely paused, made room for something that never moved again. Around it, life continued. Riders passed, alliances shifted, messages changed hands. The stone watched without responding. It did not compete for attention. It waited for curiosity to slow someone down. This balance between movement and memory defined the steppe's relationship with time. Urgent information traveled light and fast. Meaning traveled heavy and slow. Feelings, if they appeared at all, arrived last. Borders here were not lines but zones. Influence expanded and contracted like breath. What mattered was not where you stood, but how quickly you could reach the next place. Authority followed routes, not territories. To control movement was more effective than to control land. This made the steppe an ideal conduit. News from distant courts arrived stripped of ceremony. Rumors lost exaggeration through repetition. What survived the journey tended to be accurate enough to act on. The steppe did not embellish well, it favored essentials. The people who lived inside this system developed a particular calm. They expected change. They were not startled by it. When alliances adjusted, it felt like weather shifting rather than catastrophe. Adaptation was built into daily life. Humor, when it appeared, was dry. A joke about a message arriving late carried more weight than a complaint. Delay was the only real offense. Everything else could be negotiated. The wind itself became a kind of participant. It erased tracks quickly, reminding everyone that permanence was rare. What endured had to be intentional. Hence the stone. Hence the carving deep enough to resist erosion longer than a generation. At night, camps settled without illusion of isolation. Somewhere, a rider was moving. Somewhere else, a message was being carried closer. The steppe never fully slept. It rested in shifts, like the systems it supported. The memorial did not glow. It did not announce anniversaries. It remained indifferent to the calendar. Riders who passed years later would not always know who Kultigan was, but they would know that someone important enough to carve into stone had once moved through this space. And that knowledge, however faint, altered perception. It added depth to motion. It reminded travelers that speed alone does not satisfy everything a society needs to remember. This is how the steppe held contradiction comfortably. Messages flew. Stone waited. Feelings lagged behind facts. Memory stood still, while news ran past it endlessly. In a year that felt quiet elsewhere, the steppe remained active, not loudly, but efficiently. It did not pause to interpret events. It transmitted them. Interpretation was left to those with the luxury of staying still. If history likes to imagine turning points announced with force, the steppe offers a correction. Change often arrives already moving, already halfway gone by the time anyone reacts. What matters is not the noise it makes, but whether systems exist to carry it without collapsing. Here they did. Wind passed, riders followed, stone endured, and somewhere between motion and stillness the year continued, unaware that it was being observed, content to let its messages travel faster than anyone's feelings about them. The Silk Road in a normal week, water, fodder, and counting days. The Silk Road does not like being romanticized. Romance adds weight. Weight slows things down. In a normal week, the road prefers arithmetic. How much water remains, how far the next well is, whether fodder will last until dusk, how many days have already been counted and how many are still owed to the horizon. Morning begins with inventory, not reflection. Leather skins are squeezed, lifted, judged by feel. Grain is rattled in sacks to make sure moisture has not claimed it overnight. Salt is measured not as seasoning, but as insurance for people and for animals that will refuse blandness long before they refuse distance. Nothing here is mysterious. Everything is provisional. Caravans move when they must, not when they feel inspired. Departure times are chosen for temperature, not poetry. Hooves sound dull against earth that has heard them for centuries and does not bother to respond. The road is not a single line. It is a collection of preferences, detours learned through experience, adjustments made after storms, wars, or simply a bad year for grass. Water decides the day. It decides pace, stops, tempers, and negotiations. When water is abundant, conversation stretches. When it is scarce, words shrink to essentials. People become efficient. Humor dries out first. Courtesy follows. Planning becomes sharper. No one argues with thirst. It wins quietly and consistently. Fodder matters more than morale. Animals do not negotiate. They consume. Their needs are predictable and therefore respected. Salt blocks are carried carefully, protected from moisture as if they were currency. In many ways they are. A well-fed animal is a promise kept. A hungry one is a schedule collapsing. Shelter is counted in hours rather than miles. Night arrives without concern for ambition. When it does, sleep is practical. Bedding is thin. The ground is familiar. Comfort is a rumor from somewhere else. People rest because they must, not because conditions invite it. Dreams, if they appear, are brief and unsentimental. Stations along the way do not announce themselves as landmarks. They present as relief, a place to stop without explanation. Fees are paid without ceremony. Everyone understands why. The road does not maintain itself, someone does. Payment is not tribute. It is participation in continuity. Bargaining occurs when exhaustion peaks. Prices shift subtly as energy declines. Voices lower, gestures replace arguments. There is an unspoken agreement not to prolong disputes unnecessarily. Everyone wants the same thing, to finish the transaction and sit down. Fairness here is measured by speed as much as outcome. Counting days becomes an art, not the dramatic counting of time passing, but the practical tally of progress. One day gained, one day lost, a delay absorbed, a shortcut considered, then rejected because it looks promising rather than reliable. The road punishes optimism more consistently than it punishes caution. This is what a quiet year looks like on the Silk Road. Not silence, but absence of disruption large enough to alter routines. Goods move, people arrive close enough to when they said they would. Losses occur at tolerable rates. Profits are modest, but repeatable. Nothing here asks to be remembered. Everything asks to be finished. Merchants do not imagine themselves as participants in history. They imagine themselves as professionals. Deadlines matter because reputation does. A late arrival is not tragic. It is expensive. Reliability builds slowly and collapses quickly. The road remembers failures longer than successes. Cloth is inspected by touch rather than description. Texture tells more truth than origin stories. Metal is weighed, not admired. Spices are smelled cautiously. Strong aroma can hide poor quality. Experience substitutes for trust. Trust is reserved for roots, not people. Even danger feels procedural. Escorts are hired, routes are adjusted. Information is exchanged in fragments that become useful only when combined with experience. Fear exists, but it does not dominate. Panic is inefficient. Calm keeps margins intact. At midday, movement slows. Heat insists. People drink carefully, aware that consumption now affects decisions later. Animals rest in what shade can be improvised. The road accepts pauses as long as they are brief and intentional. Indecision is the only unacceptable delay. There is a faint irony in how much planning goes into something so often described as adventurous. Adventure implies surprise. Logistics imply avoidance of it. The Silk Road, in practice, is a machine designed to reduce novelty to manageable levels. When novelty appears anyway, it is handled quietly and remembered cautiously. Night conversations are short, energy is conserved. Stories, if told, are familiar ones. Routes that behaved well, places that did not. Warnings delivered without drama. Advice here is not inspirational, it is preventative. Do not try that pass after rain. Do not trust that scale. Count your water twice. Sleep arrives unevenly. Someone is always awake. Someone is always listening. Security is distributed across habits rather than guards. This is not negligence, it is adaptation. The road does not reward rigidity. Morning repeats the pattern. Inventory again. Counting again. Movement resumes. Progress is measured not by distance, but by the absence of complications. A good day is one that leaves nothing to explain. From the outside, it may seem underwhelming. Where are the legends, the turning points, the moments of revelation? They are elsewhere, or they are postponed. The Silk Road's contribution to history is not drama, but delivery. It brings things where they are expected, often enough to reshape economies quietly. A normal week does not end with applause. It ends with arrival close enough to schedule to preserve credibility. Goods change hands. Accounts are adjusted. The road releases travelers back into places that pretend not to depend on it, even as they do. This is the gentle truth the road teaches. Continuity is impressive only after it has been interrupted. As long as it holds, it feels invisible. People plan around it without gratitude. They complain when it falters, forget it when it works. In a year that felt calm, the Silk Road did exactly what it was built to do. It converted distance into delay, delay into cost, and cost into calculation. It moved not because it wanted to, but because stopping would have required explanation. So the days were counted. Water was measured. Fodder was rationed. Fees were paid. Bargains were struck with tired voices and steady hands. History, if it passed through, did so quietly, riding in a saddlebag between sacks of salt and bundles of cloth. Tang Frontier Admin, the empire that breathes through borders. An empire does not breathe through speeches, it breathes through borders. In the year 732, the Tang dynasty was not holding its breath. It was inhaling and exhaling steadily through passes, outposts, relay stations, and reports that arrived with dust still clinging to their edges. From the capital, the frontier looked like a line. From the frontier, it felt like a system of lungs expanding, contracting, never still, for long. The borders were complicated and everyone knew it. Complexity was not a failure of control, it was the condition of it. North of the agrarian heartlands, movement never stopped long enough to be simplified. Groups such as the Khitan and the Kumoshi did not exist as static problems. They existed as variables, sometimes cooperative, sometimes resistant, always mobile. The empire did not respond with panic. It responded with ledgers. From the capital's perspective, the frontier was primarily an administrative challenge. Grain had to arrive where soldiers were stationed. Horses had to be rotated before exhaustion turned into liability. Supplies were calculated in advance, not because commanders expected calm, but because uncertainty was permanent. A quiet year did not mean the absence of tension. It meant the presence of planning. Couriers moved along relay stations that functioned like punctuation marks across distance. Each stop existed to prevent delay from accumulating. Messages did not need to be dramatic. They needed to be legible, timely, and intact. Reports from the frontier were read, not for emotion, but for discrepancies. Numbers were scanned. Language was checked for precision. Vague phrasing invited follow-up, and follow-up consumed time. Horses mattered more than declarations. They were fed, rested, replaced, and recorded with care that bordered on affection. A tired horse was a bureaucratic failure long before it was a military one. Stables were inspected, fodder inventories updated, salt allocations adjusted. The empire's ability to respond depended on whether animals could move when required. Power here wore reins, not crowns. Military activity along the northern edges existed, certainly, but it arrived filtered through administration. What reached the center was not the clash, but the cost. How much grain was consumed, how many mounts required replacement, how long it took for a unit to redeploy. These details shaped decisions more than heroism ever could. Valor was acknowledged. Logistics were trusted. Officials stationed near the frontier lived double lives. By day, they managed supply chains and correspondence. By night, they listened to wind and worried about whether reports would arrive before conditions changed. Their authority was quiet, procedural, and fragile. Too much initiative looked like insubordination. Too little looked like negligence. Balance was everything. Paper flowed outward. Instructions were copied carefully. Seals applied with practiced hands. Each document assumed a reader who was tired, busy, and far from the capital's reassurance. Clarity was an act of kindness. Ambiguity was a risk. The empire learned to phrase itself conservatively, preferring instructions that could survive translation into action without interpretation. Frontier granaries slept full when planning worked. When they did not, explanations followed, written slowly and read critically. Failure was tolerated only when it could be accounted for. Excuses without numbers aged poorly. The Tang state did not demand perfection. It demanded traceability. There is a mild irony in how calm such a system feels when observed at the right distance. Outsiders imagine borders as sites of constant alarm. Inside the administrative flow, alarm is inefficient. What exists instead is vigilance, stretched thin but continuous. Adjustments happen incrementally. Reinforcements are dispatched not with fanfare, but with paperwork. Communication with groups beyond the frontier followed similar logic. Diplomacy was not theatrical, it was transactional. Gifts were listed, obligations clarified, expectations managed carefully to avoid escalation through misunderstanding. The empire preferred predictable relationships, even strained ones, to volatile silence. In 732, reports mentioned movement, pressure, the need for readiness. None of this translated into a sense of impending collapse. The machinery absorbed the information and responded with minor recalibrations. More grain here, more mounts there. A shift in personnel. The system breathed in the data, then breathed out instructions. For those living far from the capital, the empire felt present not as ideology but as schedule. Deliveries arrived when promised often enough to justify trust. Pay was late occasionally, but rarely forgotten. Law was distant but recognizable. This consistency mattered more than charisma. Education for frontier officials emphasized endurance. Training did not inspire grandeur. It taught survival inside procedure. Knowing which form to file mattered as much as knowing which road to take. Mistakes here echoed outward slowly, creating friction that could be felt weeks later. Prevention was prized. At night, lamps burned low in offices where ledgers were reviewed one last time. Totals were reconciled, horses accounted for, messages prepared for morning departure. The border did not sleep, but it rested in cycles, like the empire itself. There is something quietly effective about a state that treats its edges as organs rather than scars. Borders were not places where control ended. They were places where control had to work hardest without applause. The Tang dynasty understood that authority weakens when it shouts. It strengthens when it organizes. Humor existed in the margins. Officials joked softly about the number of seals required to move a single cart of grain. Soldiers complained about paperwork more than patrols. Complaints, after all, were a sign that systems were functioning well enough to be irritating rather than terrifying. The year passed without spectacle at the frontier, not because nothing happened, but because everything necessary was absorbed into routine. Reports continued, supplies moved, horses breathed. The empire inhaled uncertainty and exhaled order. From the outside, this might look dull. From within, it felt like competence. And competence, when sustained, produces a particular kind of calm, one that lulls attention and convinces participants that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to prepare for. That is how the Tang frontier held, not by freezing its borders, but by letting them move, respond, and breathe. In a year that did not know it was being watched, the empire did what it did best. It continued quietly through the careful management of distance. Night markets and day ledgers when cities don't perform. Cities reveal their confidence at night, not when they celebrate, not when they decorate themselves for visitors, but when they lower their voice and continue anyway. In the eastern cities of the 8th century, places like Chang'an, strength did not announce itself. It kept accounts, boiled tea, closed shutters carefully, and trusted that morning would arrive with the same obligations it had already prepared for. When daylight faded, markets did not vanish. They changed tone, stalls narrowed, goods simplified, conversation shortened. Lamps were lit, not to impress, but to see accurately. The city did not need spectacle to feel alive. It needed transactions to complete and records to balance. Tea houses became quieter versions of themselves. Cups were rinsed methodically. Water temperatures were judged without instruments. Patrons lingered not out of leisure, but because the day had not quite released them yet. Deals concluded softly, with nods instead of signatures. Trust here was habitual. Reputation moved faster than ink. Shops closed in sequence rather than all at once. Each door pulled shut carried a sense of order. Locks clicked. Curtains dropped. Not as defense, but as punctuation. The city understood how to end a sentence without drawing attention to it. Somewhere nearby, clerks continued to write. Ledgers did not sleep when markets dimmed. Numbers waited patiently. Columns were checked again, not because anyone expected surprise, but because error prefers fatigue. Lamps burned low over desks, where the city reduced itself to figures that could be managed. The soundscape softened. Wheels stopped. Voices lowered. Footsteps remained, measured and purposeful. Night guards passed with familiarity rather than authority, their presence reassured without demanding acknowledgement. Safety here was not dramatic. It was procedural. Cities often get described as performances, grand stages of culture and power, but the most resilient cities are strongest when they stop performing, when they no longer need to prove relevance. Chang'an at night did not persuade. It persisted. Food continued to circulate. Simple dishes replaced elaborate ones. Broth, rice, steamed buns, things designed to satisfy without discussion. Hunger was addressed efficiently. Excess waited for daylight. The city knew how to prioritize without announcing priorities. In back rooms, accounts were settled, receipts matched, discrepancies noted calmly. Tomorrow would handle them. The goal was not perfection, but continuity. A city that demands perfection exhausts itself. One that demands accuracy endures. Craftspeople worked late when necessary, not for inspiration but for deadlines. A pot needed firing before humidity shifted. Fabric needed finishing before morning delivery. Work continued because stopping would cost more than continuing. The city calculated rest as carefully as labor. Education followed similar rhythms. Students copied texts under watchful but untheatrical supervision. Learning was not framed as enlightenment, it was framed as competence. The city needed people who could read instructions and follow them. Genius was optional. Reliability was not. There is a gentle humor in how unimpressed cities are with their own scale. Thousands of people coexisted without remarking on the fact. Density became background. The extraordinary was normalized through repetition. Awe, if it appeared, was brief and quickly replaced by errands. Night markets catered to necessity rather than novelty. Repairs, essentials, items forgotten during the day. They did not aim to delight, they aimed to function. Customers appreciated this. Delight can wait. Function cannot. Street cleaners moved quietly. Refuse was gathered before it could announce itself. Cleanliness was not aesthetic, it was preventative. The city understood that neglect compounds faster than ambition. Maintenance mattered more than memory. Somewhere, a bell marked time not dramatically, but reliably. Hours passed, shifts changed, responsibility transferred without ceremony. Systems rested in layers. No single part carried the whole weight. Visitors sometimes mistook this calm for dullness. They expected grandeur, declarations, visible authority. Instead, they found efficiency. Efficiency rarely photographs well. It does not ask to be admired, it asks to be used. The city's real power lived in predictability. People planned their lives around schedules that mostly held. Shops opened when expected. Payments arrived close enough to on time. Disputes were resolved slowly but consistently. This consistency produced trust deeper than enthusiasm ever could. At night, even governance softened. Officials went home, offices closed. Authority receded into paper and habit. The city trusted its own momentum. It did not require supervision every hour. That trust was earned, not assumed. The next morning would bring ledgers back into prominence. Figures would be tallied, taxes assessed, supplies ordered. The city's heartbeat would return to full volume. But the night showed something essential. Strength did not vanish when attention did. Cities that rely on performance grow anxious when the audience leaves. Cities that rely on operation grow comfortable with silence. Chang'an belonged to the second category. Its confidence was quiet enough to be mistaken for absence. This is the paradox of urban endurance. The less a city insists on being seen, the longer it lasts. When it stops narrating itself, it becomes easier to inhabit. People sleep better in places that do not demand applause. So the night passed. Markets thinned. Ledgers filled. Doors closed. Lamps dimmed. Nothing about it suggested greatness, and that perhaps was the point. By morning, the city would resume without having reset. There would be no announcement, no overture. Just continuity dense, practiced, and quietly persuasive. When cities don't perform, they reveal what they are made of. Not spectacle, but systems. Not declarations, but decisions, repeated until they feel like nature. And in that unperformed night balanced between market murmurs and ledger lines, the city rested, confident enough to let silence do some of the work. Monasteries, schools, and the slow work of memory. Memory in early medieval Europe did not move quickly. It sat down, it sharpened a blade, it mixed ink until the texture felt right, and then it waited long enough for a hand to steady itself before making the first mark. While the world outside worried about movement troops, borders, news memory preferred rooms with tables, light that fell predictably, and silence broken only by careful work. These places were not loud. They were not designed to persuade. Whether attached to monasteries or schools, they functioned as workshops of attention. People came here not to be inspired, but to be accurate. The task was not to create something new, but to keep something old from disappearing too quickly. The day often began before conversation. Parchment needed preparation. Animal skins were scraped patiently, imperfections removed with a pressure learned through repetition. Too much force ruined the surface. Too little left it uneven. The material taught restraint better than any instruction ever could. Ink followed, not purchased, not standardized, but made. Ingredients were ground slowly, mixed until consistency replaced guesswork. Ink that flowed too easily bled into thoughtlessness. Ink that resisted too much encouraged impatience. The correct balance rewarded calm. This was not chemistry for curiosity's sake. It was chemistry for legibility. Writing itself was physical labor. Letters were not expressions of personality. They were agreements. A particular curve meant a particular sound. Deviating from that agreement invited confusion centuries later. The scribe's goal was not beauty, though beauty sometimes appeared anyway. The goal was clarity that could survive time. Schools trained this discipline quietly. Students learned by copying, not by inventing. Copying was not considered inferior. It was considered foundational. Before one could interpret, one had to transmit without distortion. Accuracy preceded insight. This order mattered. Pages filled slowly. Errors were corrected carefully. A scraped mistake left a faint scar, a reminder that memory always bears marks of effort. Nothing here suggested haste. Speed was the enemy. A rushed line was a future problem. There is gentle irony in how much patience history requires, while rewarding impatience in its stories. Narratives celebrate bold figures, decisive actions, dramatic turns, but the survival of those narratives often depends on someone who never appears in them, someone whose most notable trait was consistency. These rooms were not insulated from the world. News arrived eventually, carried by travelers or copied into margins, but it arrived softened, stripped of urgency. The work continued regardless. The past did not interrupt itself to accommodate the present. Light was managed carefully. Windows were positioned to reduce glare. Candles were used sparingly. Shadows were accepted. The environment taught compromise. Perfect conditions were rare. Work proceeded anyway. Silence here was not enforced. It emerged naturally. Talking distracted the hand. Distraction invited error. Error wasted material. The logic was practical rather than spiritual. Focus saved resources. Books were treated as tools rather than relics. They were stored, repaired, recopied when wear demanded it. No one assumed permanence. Longevity was earned through repetition. A text that mattered was copied again, one that did not faded quietly. This process favored certain kinds of knowledge. What survived was what was useful, teachable, repeatable. Excess commentary fell away. Clarity endured. The system filtered without announcing criteria. Memory, like logistics, optimized itself. Humor existed, but quietly. A note in the margin. A small correction made with unnecessary elegance. A flourish added once the main work was done as a reward for restraint. These gestures did not undermine seriousness. They humanized it. The people doing this work rarely imagined themselves as guardians of civilization. They imagined themselves as finishing today's task without ruining it. Ambition stayed small. That is often how it succeeds. When fatigue arrived, it was acknowledged. Hands rested, eyes closed briefly. Returning too soon risked mistakes. The schedule respected limits. Endurance mattered more than intensity. Outside seasons shifted. Inside, the pace remained steady. Time here was measured by pages completed, not by events avoided. The outside world could accelerate. Memory refused to match its speed. Schools shared this rhythm. Teaching focused on competence, reading aloud, copying, correcting. The goal was not to dazzle, but to prepare students to participate in the same slow work. Continuity required successors. History often frames this period as one of preservation against loss. That framing misses something important. This was not defensive labor, it was routine labor. People did not save texts because they feared disappearance. They copied them because copying was what one did when a text proved useful. The result, centuries later, looks intentional. It was not. It was cumulative. Small decisions repeated produced survival. No single day felt significant. Together, they mattered enormously. There is a quiet lesson here delivered without instruction. Memory is not heroic. It is procedural. It survives not through passion, but through patience aligned with habit. The irony sharpens gently. History loves to spotlight great names, to credit preservation to visionaries. But often what endured did so because someone wrote neatly, followed rules, and returned the next day to do the same thing again. Ink dried, pages were stacked, covers closed. Work paused, not because it was finished, but because daylight was. Tomorrow would resume where today stopped. Continuity required no announcement. In a year that did not know it was being watched, this slow work continued. No one here expected applause. They expected the material to behave if treated correctly. That expectation was usually met, and so memory accumulated line by line, not dramatic enough to interrupt the world, not fragile enough to vanish easily, supported by hands that preferred accuracy over speed and patience over recognition. If history still speaks from this period, it is not because it was loud. It is because it was copied carefully by people who understood that the future would not remember them and worked neatly anyway. That is the slow work of memory. Quiet, repetitive, unimpressed by significance, and remarkably effective. Climate of the everyday, mud, cold, and the politics of staying warm. There are years remembered for storms of men, and there are years remembered quietly, privately, for weather, for mud that refused to dry, for cold that lingered longer than politeness would suggest, for the daily negotiations between bodies and the elements, carried out without witnesses and without applause. In a calm year, survival often looks unimpressive. It looks like boots that hold together one more season, like wool that still insulates even when damp, like a fire that stays small because fuel must last. These are not victories that make it into chronicles. They are victories that allow chronicles to exist at all. Mud was the first condition to be negotiated. Roads softened, paths widened into inconvenience. Movement slowed, not because of strategy, but because suction exists. People adjusted without commentary. Steps shortened. Loads lightened. Schedules recalibrated. The ground dictated terms, and everyone complied. Cold followed with less flexibility. It entered homes politely through gaps that had always been there. Windows were covered, doors sealed imperfectly. Firewood was stacked with a seriousness that bordered on affection. Each log represented hours of future warmth, allocated carefully. Burning too much too early was a mistake. Burning too little invited consequences that lingered. Clothing became architecture. Layers replaced walls where walls failed. Wool was prized not for softness but for forgiveness. It performed even when neglected. Linen behaved when dry. Leather resisted wind. Repairs were constant and uncelebrated. A patched sleeve was not a sign of poverty. It was a sign of planning. Shoes mattered enormously. Wet feet ruined days efficiently. Soles were inspected before dawn. Small leaks were tolerated if they could be managed. A good pair of shoes extended mobility more reliably than any decree. This was politics at foot level. Sleeping arrangements shifted with temperature. People slept closer together without discussion. Animals moved nearer to shared walls. Heat was treated as a communal resource. Privacy adjusted accordingly. Comfort was negotiated nightly, not assumed. Beds were simpler than memory suggests. Straw compressed quickly. Blankets were layered thoughtfully. Bodies learned positions that conserved warmth. Sleep was shallow at first, then deeper once trust in the night settled. Dreams, if they came, were brief and practical. Fire was not romantic. It was managed, tended, coaxed. Ashes were saved because they would be useful later. Embers were banked carefully to ease the next morning's labor. Losing a fire overnight was not tragic. It was exhausting. The difference mattered. Food followed the climate, heavier when possible, hot when available. Meals were timed around warmth. Eating too early wasted heat. Eating too late invited discomfort. Cooking became a schedule aligned with fuel and daylight. Appetite learned restraint. Illness hovered quietly. Colds were not dramatic but persistent. Avoiding them required habits rather than remedies. Dry clothes, warm hands, enough sleep. These strategies were unglamorous and surprisingly effective. In a quiet year, staying healthy felt like success. There is a mild irony in how weather enforces equality. Cold does not recognize rank. Mud does not respect titles. Everyone adapts or suffers. Hierarchies soften slightly when the environment insists on cooperation. Warmth becomes a shared objective. At night, sounds changed. Wind made itself known. Roofs responded. Fires whispered. The world contracted to interiors and breathing. This contraction was not fear. It was focus. Attention narrowed to what mattered immediately. People spoke less, not out of reverence, but out of conservation. Warm air was precious. Silence retained heat. Conversations waited for daylight or better conditions. The year learned to lower its voice. Humor survived in understatement. Complaints were phrased gently. "It is cold today" meant something specific. Everyone understood. No elaboration was necessary. Shared discomfort reduced the need for explanation. Morning arrived with negotiations renewed. Was it warmer? No. But it was familiar. Familiarity made endurance easier. Habits resumed. Fires revived. Clothes shook free of stiffness. The day proceeded without optimism, but with competence. This is the texture of a sleep version year. Nothing interrupts. Nothing demands reaction beyond adjustment. The body learns. The household adapts. The community synchronizes subtly around temperature and terrain. Politics, in this context, is simply the allocation of warmth. Who sits closest to the fire? Who gets the thicker blanket? Who walks out first into the cold? These decisions are rarely framed as power. They are framed as necessity, and necessity rarely invites debate. Outside mud continued its slow work. Inside heat was counted. The balance held often enough to avoid crisis. That was the measure of success. History prefers to remember years by what changed. This year asks to be remembered by what continued despite conditions that made continuation uncomfortable. No speeches marked that endurance. No records praised it. Bodies simply adapted. As the night deepened, breathing slowed, fires settled. Cold pressed against structures that had learned how to resist it just enough. Sleep arrived not as escape, but as agreement with the circumstances. Tomorrow would repeat the negotiation, and the day after that. And somehow, through repetition, people won small victories that never asked to be named. In a year that did not know it was being watched, the greatest achievement may have been simple. People stayed warm enough to sleep. And sleep, when it comes without interruption, is a quiet kind of triumph. A quiet ending. 732. Doesn't conclude. It simply hands off the night. The year does not gather itself for a final statement. It does not check whether anyone is listening. It does not lower its voice to sound meaningful. It simply reaches the end of a sequence and continues, the way breathing continues when no one is counting. One day follows another, and the label changes while the substance barely notices. There is no curtain call for 732, no summary delivered in a clear tone, no sense of resolution. The year slides into the next one the way a ledger page turns carefully without tearing, revealing a familiar layout beneath. Columns remain, totals continue. Nothing demands applause. From the perspective of large things, empires, borders, ambitions, this transition looks insignificant. Structures remain in place. Systems persist. Authorities wake up with the same responsibilities they had yesterday. Maps do not redraw themselves overnight. Plans do not evaporate. If you stand far enough away, the change is barely visible. But from the perspective that actually experiences time, the handoff feels complete enough. Dinner ends. Plates are cleared. A path home is followed in the dark without surprise. Doors are closed with a practiced motion that does not invite reflection. The body learns where the threshold is without looking. Wood meets wood. The sound is reassuring precisely because it is ordinary. A quiet year ends the way it lived by making room for sleep. People prepare for night without ceremony. Fires are banked, not extinguished. Shoes are placed where they will be found easily in the morning. Clothing is folded loosely so it does not resist later. These gestures carry more truth than any declaration about endings. They assume continuation. They assume tomorrow. There is something faintly ironic about how much historical weight gets attached to moments that felt this small at the time. Later voices will insist that this year mattered, that it turned something, that it set a course. But on the ground, the final nights were occupied with more convincing concerns: warmth, fatigue, the quiet hope that sleep would come quickly. The city lights dim, not because of symbolism, but because fuel is finite. Streets empty at a pace that feels negotiated rather than enforced. Someone lingers to finish a task. Someone else leaves early, having decided that enough is enough. These decisions shape the night far more than any unseen calendar boundary. At home, food is simple. Leftovers become strategy. Nothing is wasted because waste will be noticed later. Eating is unhurried. Hunger has been satisfied often enough this year to feel trustworthy. When scarcity appears, it is addressed with habit rather than panic. This, too, is an ending that knows how to continue. Beds are prepared without discussion. Sleep is not framed as reward, it is framed as requirement. Bodies settle into positions learned through repetition. The night does not promise anything except rest, and even that is conditional. Still, people lie down willingly. Willingness counts for a lot. Somewhere, someone writes a final note for the year. Not a reflection, just a reminder. A count. A small correction to be handled later. Ink dries. The pen is set aside. Paper waits. It will be there in the morning. This is the quiet confidence of systems that do not fear interruption. The outside world does not pause to observe the transition. Wind continues to move. Animals shift in their sleep. Water finds its level. The year hands off the night to the next one without asking permission. No one objects. This is not anticlimax. It is accuracy. History often expects endings to justify themselves. It expects closure, punctuation, meaning made explicit. But lived time resists these expectations. It prefers continuity with minor adjustments. It prefers nights that feel like other nights. The relief is subtle but real. Ambitions remain, borders remain, tensions remain. They are folded neatly and placed where they can be retrieved later. For now, they do not interfere with sleep. They have learned, at least temporarily, to wait. Morning will arrive without acknowledging the change. People will wake with the same stiffness, the same obligations, the same small calculations. Someone will notice the date has changed. Someone else will not. Both will proceed anyway. There is a gentle humor in how little effort the year makes to be remembered. After all the attention it will receive later, after all the arguments about its significance, it ends by doing almost nothing at all. It simply stops being today and becomes yesterday. If there is a lesson here, it does not announce itself. It suggests quietly that endings are most effective when they do not demand recognition. That continuity is not the absence of change, but the manner in which change is absorbed. The year does not conclude with fireworks. It concludes with routine, with people trusting that the ground will still be there when they step on it in the morning, with doors that close properly, with fires that hold through the night, with the unspoken agreement that waking up is still the plan. Later historians will circle back. They will point, interpret, argue. They will try to make the year stand still, long enough to explain itself. But explanation was never its job. Its job was to be lived. And so it hands off the night, gently, without comment, leaving behind a sense not of finality, but of rest. A rest that feels earned not by achievement, but by persistence. As sleep deepens, the difference between 732 and what comes next dissolves. Breathing continues. The body settles. The world holds. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Tonight the year lets go, not dramatically, not reluctantly, but competently. That is how quiet years end. Not with a conclusion, but with sleep.